everybody. I'm Amanda Liberty from the Rangeley Lakes Heritage Trust. I do programs here, and we're really thankful for you joining us this evening with Lead with Nature and Dan here. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to him.
Short and sweet. I love it. Well, thank you all for attending tonight. Yes, Jerry, I see you made it in. Awesome. I recognize a lot of names here. Fabulous. And a number I don't, but hey, thanks for showing up. As winter slowly clamps its grip on us here, we still have snow on the ground in a lot of places, and you don't need snow on the ground to track too. So I'm glad you're here. I literally just hung up my snowshoes thinking, I don't know if I'm going to need them again this season, but I love thinking about winter tracking even when I'm not doing it. And for the sake of tonight, we're mostly going to look at winter tracks in terms of actual footprints in snow, but we'll talk about tracking a lot more than that. So yeah, again, just gratitude for showing up. I'm going to get right into it here. Presentation is going to probably run about 30-ish minutes, maybe a little longer. And then we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions and answers. Amanda will be keeping an eye on the Q&A and chat, and also on Facebook Live, where we're streaming right now. All right, so let's dig right in. All right. Beautiful. So this is, I think of tracking as an opportunity to make some connections, to better understand our non-human neighbors that we're sharing this world with, this more than human world. It's really easy to forget sometimes, at least for me, that we do live in a more than human world, but we do. And, there's a lot we can learn from the other species, the other habitats, landscapes, things that we share this world with. So for me, tracking is one way of doing that. And it's one of the ways I really enjoy to do that in my work here at Lead with Nature. My work is a variety of things that bring awareness and attention and connection to nature, whether I'm doing that with businesses and consulting work, whether I'm doing that with presentations, whether I'm doing that with mentoring, programs, you name it. So grateful to have this partnership with Rangeley Lakes Heritage Trust tonight and the great work they're doing in the Rangeley region and beyond to facilitate connection, to bring people to gorgeous places, accessible nature, wild nature, nearby nature, to foster a sense of place. Important work, and I'm grateful to be connected. So I don't know what tracking is. I've got my definition for it, but y'all might have your own definitions, and that's fine. But since you're here listening to me, I get to tell you what my definition is. So for me, tracking really is, it's paying attention, right? It's noticing things that, some which are pretty darn obvious, like this here red maple. That looks like it's been snacked on quite heavily by our friend the beaver. Right. And it's also not just paying attention, but it's paying attention to the movement of energy in my mind. Tracking isn't just about saying, oh, look, there's a rotary lope of a fissure across a vernal pool, which it is. But it's also saying, hey, there's Fisher. What was Fisher doing? Where's Fisher right now? What do I really know about Fisher? Right. And where is Fisher bringing its energy right now? Where was its last meal? Where is its next meal? Right? Who's paying attention to Fisher? Who's telling me Fisher's around the bend? Who's not? Right? We are a player. We are alive. We are connected to a bigger world, a more than human world. And tracking helps us remember that. It helps us remember that it's not just all about the bubble of our existence and our own thoughts and ideas and worries and concerns and joys. It's about connection to something a lot bigger. And to me, that means a richer life in a lot of ways. So here we're talking about tracking, and tracking can be really interesting, maybe really confusing. Maybe you look down on the side of the road and you see this. You're like, whoa, look at them 3-toed, chunky, ice cream cone looking, funky, big feet. Those toes, by the way, those bird feet are about 4.5 inches long. They're pretty big and heavy. And then you got these other things on the side that kind of look like maybe someone was walking a dog, but they weren't. And then you got some weird red gook in the middle. Like, ooh, there's a story. So tracking is story catching, story sharing, storytelling, right? The tracking is really being part of the story. So before we get into some identification and all that kind of good stuff, I just want to talk about a few considerations, right? So when we are tracking, when we are intentionally going out and we're trying to connect with wildlife and understand wildlife, I just want us to remember that, you know, wild animals have agendas too. They have needs, they have sensitivities, they have emotions, they have personalities. And so I think it's important for us just to remember to just be mindful, right? I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do anything, except maybe please be mindful and remember what you're doing, right? So this is Bobcat. This happens to be male bobcat. I don't have a name for this bobcat, but it's a bobcat I got to know just a tiny bit. I mean, barely, just a tiny bit. Didn't really invest enough time and energy to know this bobcat well, and really didn't make it a priority to do that. It would have took a lot of work, a lot of time, and continued work on my skill and understanding and following these animals. But this picture is taken from a trail camera. I was not present, but I left this camera in a place where I knew that bobcat traveled frequently. That decision alone is one I got to think about, right? Bobcats, they're curious. They're somewhat tolerant of people. Some might say very tolerant, depending on where you live. But this is also an area where sometimes bobcats might den. So, for instance, today, mid-March, I wouldn't be down there sticking a trail camera because this is the time of year that they're starting to look for dens where I live. They're engaged in courtship and mating and thinking about where they're going to raise kittens. And that's a pretty sensitive thing with bobcats in general. They want to do that very carefully. They're concerned about the well-being of their family. But this male, he was coming through this area almost like clockwork, about once every 10 to 14 days. It was usually about 12 days. And he was on a big circuit. And this was in midwinter, maybe early midwinter. And I happened to get a number of pictures of him a number of times and places on the landscape. But this is one I was really excited about just because I thought it was a beautiful animal. And it was one that I was looking to find for quite a while. So let's just remember, they have agendas too, right? They're not just there for our entertainment. They're not just there, to kind of please us. They've got lives, and so I just want to give them some props there. So we're going to move into a little overview of a number of wild animal families. Now, in the course of 35 minutes, you can't cover them all, folks. It ain't going to happen. So I'm just going to give you a little sampling, a little taster, some hors d'oeuvres, so to speak. Here on the left, we have a gorgeous picture in the snow of a large animal. You've got 5 toes. You've got very obvious claws. Got a big, broad, wide kind of pad in the middle. You got some feet that are shaped almost triangularly, like, say, our feet. So someone who's probably walking on their heels, aka a plantigrade mammal. And many of you probably looking at this thinking, like, is that a bear? And you'd be correct. So my friend Sue Mansfield got this picture in Southwest New Hampshire ways back, I believe. Beautiful. This is not the same black bear, and this photo is not. Oh, wasn't mine either. But black bears, many people don't know. Like my good friend Phil Brown in Southwest New Hampshire wrote up a great story about a big old black bear that didn't quite follow the rules in terms of winter behavior. Because you know what, they don't read field guides. They don't know what they're quote unquote supposed to do. And Phil, who works at the Harris Center, he's director of bird conservation over there. Does a lot of great naturalist work, and he took his family following the trails of this bear, of a big old bear in the snow. Not this bear, and this bear had learned how to find bird feeders in wintertime and was happily eating off of those and changed its behavior. Didn't go into torpor, didn't decide to sleep most or big chunks of the winter. And that's a story he learned because he was paying attention and a neighbor was paying attention. and saw some tracks. And he took the opportunity to follow those tracks. So following tracks, like I said, puts us into stories. We become part of the story. We become part of this more than human world. So it's helpful to know what you're looking at sometimes, right? So we're going to break down a handful of families here. And then again, if you have questions, just write them down or throw them in the chat there or Q&A, wherever they're wanted, and we'll talk about them later. So tracks, footprints. Here we have a gorgeous footprint. This is on the ice. It's one of those like styrofoamy, thin, hard snows in a sub-freezing conditions. 4 big toes that are kind of fingerprint shaped oval, a pretty large pad. Excuse me. 4 pretty obvious claws. That formula, 4 toes plus claws, oval shape, generally leads us to the dog family, Canidae. So the Canids, the wild Canids, are all members of the dog family. We're all quite familiar with Canis familiaris, the house dog, who has evolved from probably one of our many wolves that have come around in the world. Canids are long-distance, opportunistic hunters with a varying degree of sociality, right? Our foxes are not terribly social compared to, say, our wolves or our coyotes here in North America. But the Canids are long-distance travelers. They are the ultra-marathoners. You compare them to, say, the cat family. Cats are sprinters. Canids are distance runners. There's that formula, and it's on all 4 feet, because we'll see that some animal families have, like, say, the rodents might have 5 toes on the hind feet, but only 4 toes on the front feet. But the Canids, 4 all around. We see Canids in a variety of ways. They often do a lot of trotting, tick, 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 really efficient, kind of like smooth, well, pretty smooth, a little bouncy here and there, kind of travel. Because some of them are traveling many, many miles in a night. They often use what we call direct register, where the hind foot lands exactly where the front was, right? And there could be 1,000 reasons why that's happening, including it's quiet, it's efficient, blah, blah, blah. But that's a pretty common thing to see, but not always. They also can do a lot of other stuff. They can gallop, they can lope, they can bound when they're chasing. They can stalk really quietly, but they tend to be kind of trotting along till they sniff out an opportunity or hear an opportunity or see an opportunity and then go for it, right? And in our region, we have fox. We have 2 species of fox, and then we have the complications of coyote/wolf. I like to just say we have a large canid. We have a large wild canid in New England, the genetics of which is complicated. Challenges kind of the species concept in some ways, because it's got some wolf DNA, it's got Western kind of coyote DNA. But basically, some people call them coy wolves, but we have what we generally call an Eastern coyote here, but it's a little more complicated than that. This family, can look like a variety of things. These tracks here, kind of a little bit on the smaller side. Each of these white thick bars is 1 inch on this ruler on the right side. So here you're looking at about a 2.5 inch track, a little daintier. There's a little bit of almost like a little bit of the space in between looks like a star maybe. And down here on this track, you see that little thing that just popped up there? That little red frown, right? This is really typical in the front foot of this species. And the back and the other feet sometimes show an X or even a star shape. This is our red fox, right? Red fox, one of our most abundant, one of the most successful, widespread critters, canids in the world. Super effective at adapting to near Arctic environments to full-on urban environments and everything in between. Agricultural, suburban, rural. I mean, amazing adapter. Super furry feet, doesn't really show terribly clear toes sometimes. And, the red fox, there's a beautiful winter red fox doing what it does, curiously listening and adapting and thinking about where it's going to pounce in that snow. This is an animal that is around it's probably within a mile of everyone on this call right now. It's my guess, maybe even closer, on the move. Sometimes in the perfect conditions, you can see all the details of their feet. This shows exactly how furry and hairy those feet are. And this, even in summertime, and how fine the claws can sometimes register. It's even hard to see claws on some of them, this little tiny hind foot up here. But here's that bigger front foot. And that bigger front foot is kind of showing that little frown thing here. right? But super furred feet, say compared to our gray fox. Their scat varies a lot. And folks, scat is complicated and tricky, okay? We could do 5 nights on scat alone, like no joke. It really does vary. It depends on what they're eating, how much they're eating, what's going on in their GI system, health, size, a variety of things. But usually it's kind of pointy on an end or two. It's kind of twisting. It might be in little segments or so. And you can often see what they're eating: hair, fur, bones sometimes, things like that. Kind of stinky. And when foxes are moving along, sometimes they'll do a direct register walk, sometimes they'll do a trot. This is what we call a little side trot track pattern. Basically, the front comes down here, the hind goes over it, and it keeps repeating. Picture a dog kind of walking down the sidewalk or going down a beach with his butt kind of off to the side, like tick, 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 tick. That's your classic kind of side trotting track pattern. I said they like to get into these little comfy trots. That's how they cover lots of ground. We shift over a species, a little bit rounder, clearer track here. Toes are clearer, and we almost get like an H in the middle of the space between the toes and the pad. See that? As opposed to more of an X, it's a wider, broader track. This is a curious character we don't see as often. This is gray fox, right? Gray fox are a fox that are don't go as far north on the planet, smaller, a little bit of a range. If you're living in, say, central and northern Canada, you will not see this species. Even the northern tips of Maine, you don't see it. So gray fox has these daintier, rounder tracks, almost look cat-like at times. And the claws often don't even show up. They have semi-retractable claws. They can keep sharp, and they can actually zip right up and down trees. They can play in trees, which seems kind of strange for a fox, but it is true. It happens. Very, just like the red fox, quite omnivorous in its diet. And when they're moving along, they can do a variety of things. This is a gray fox moving along here, front foot with a hind foot in front, and another front foot with a hind foot. This is also a little trotting track pattern. This one we happen to call a straddle trot, this track pattern, because the hind's feet are swinging up around the outside of the body. Then we go up a size class. Someone just asked a question about this. There's an X showing up again. This is our friend coyote, or what we're calling coyote for now, Canis latrans. So the coyote is going to be bigger than either of the foxes, right? But it's still going to have those 4 toes plus claws, oval shape. It's going to often show a little X in there. And it can be really tough to distinguish coyotes from dogs, although the scat usually is pretty darn different. So, sometimes when we find tracks, we tell people, when in doubt, follow it out. So if you pick up a fresh trail in the snow, follow that trail. Eventually, it'll probably urinate, defecate, leave clearer tracks, do something different, and you might be able to distinguish it. Coyote scat is usually a lot like fox scat, and sometimes they can overlap in size, shape, and content, so it could be tricky. But they also, like the canids, love to stick their scats right in the middle of places like trails and places they can easily be seen and smelled. Probably smelled is the key on this one, because they depend on, animals do a lot of communicating with their nose, a lot more than they do with their mouth, right? Most of our wild neighbors are olfactory communicators. We're not so much an olfactory species. So much of their kind of social media posts are made with molecules in the form of scent, whether that's urine, whether that's scat, whether that's rubbing parts of their body, different glands all over the place. And for the canines, the foxes, coyotes, wolves, you name it, they're all doing this all over the place. And they like to poop right in the middle of trails, places where that scent can be carried on the wind. They have strong jaws, the coyotes. They can crack bones. They will chew all sorts of things. This is the hoof of a deer that coyotes have been gnawing on, right? Sometimes you'll find where they can literally just crack through a long bone. They have the jaw strength to do that. Foxes don't. So that's one way we distinguish them. Someone just put a question there about how do we distinguish the tracks of coyote from dogs. Boy, it's that also could be a topic of its own. There are instances where very fit, say, working dogs of a certain size class can easily look like a coyote, and they can be almost impossible to tell apart. But in most cases, domestic dogs have sloppier tracks, wider tracks, bigger, blunter claws. They're splayed out. They're not very tight. So if I go back here, notice how these toes are kind of almost curving inward. It's a nice tight oval track. It's not a big, broad, round, wide track, right? So those are some of the things, but there's a lot. And sometimes it's just really hard. And I mean, and that's true of tracking. Like you can't always be 100%. There are times when you have to know your limitations and be like, well, it's probably this or this. And so if I'm tracking and collecting information for a study or doing something where the certainty is really important, I have to get a lot of data that tells me I need a number of factors that point towards one thing or another. If I'm just out for a walk by myself, it's not as important. I can just say, well, it's probably this or this. So kind of depends on your application. So that's all the dogs, but this is not a dog. Notice there's 4 toes, but there's no claws really registering. And look how broad and wide these things are. And look how big that pad is. And if we look at the bottom of that pad, it's got these 3 lobes, almost like 3 scallop-shaped lobes in the bottom of this big pad. And that pad, if you draw a line in the middle, whereas you can draw an X for a fox, you can't do that here. You draw a big old C, a big curved C. So these are, in fact, Felids, are wild cats. Very strange characters, fascinating characters. Here's a bobcat doing a little pounce, little somewhat fox imitation, probably going for a small mammal under that snow. So the Felids, 4 toes, no claws on all 4 feet, big broad pads, right? Here's some bobcat tracks and less ideal conditions, but this is what you get sometimes, right? They're ambush predators. They're stalkers, they're watchers, they're pouncers. You know, cats are not interested in covering many miles a night, generally speaking. There's exceptions, especially with the bigger cats like a mountain lion. But in general, they're going to cover some ground. They're going to sit. They're going to walk. They're going to go slow. They're going to bed down, lay, look, listen. You know, they're looking to cue in on something and then attack it when it's not paying attention. They're not going to try and chase down too many things from very far. It's just not their style. It's also not their design. Like I said, all 4 feet, they have 4 toes, no claws, a broad, wide kind of pad there. They move real slow. And in our region here, it's bobcats and lynx that we're mostly talking about, right? Yes, there have been occurrences of mountain lions. And yes, there even is 1 or 2 that probably made it all the way here from the West, including that sad little fellow who got hit on the Merritt Parkway in Connecticut way back when. But most of the mountain lion DNA that's been collected from any actual verified, reliable sightings, which there are very few of in New England. There's a lot of talk and there's a lot of shenanigans, but the ones that have been verified, often the DNA on those cats is found to be of the South American variety, which is really typical in the illegal pet trade. So most of those were probably pets that were either released or, somehow they ended up in the wild. So we're not going to talk about mountain lions a lot here. We're going to focus on bobcat and lynx. So bobcats are most widespread and most abundant wild felid, and we're finding that they're actually in all sorts of habitats, right? And yes, we're looking at poop again. So the scat of a bobcat, I mean, sometimes you could say it almost looks like a fox, and it kind of does here, except it's usually much thicker, it's usually much more segmented, and it's usually much denser. So if you poked it with a stick, you'd be like, dang, that's a dense scat. Cats don't eat big chunks of bones. You're not going to find usually big bone chunks in there. They're very picky eaters. It's usually dense with fur. It may be covered, it may not. In fact, most of the scats I'm finding usually aren't covered in this region. That could be somewhat of bias because covered scats are harder to find, but they don't always dig scrapes. They don't always cover their scats at all. It really depends. Wild cats like bobcats do a lot of scent marking. This is looking down directly over a walking trail of a bobcat. It's not quite stepping in its own tracks. That's an indirect register, we call that. But it is going really close to little trees like this, kind of just quickly adjusting its rump and spraying on that tree. Both males and females have the ability to spray backwards, a couple little drops, very strong smelling urine. And yes, it smells just like a litter box, folks. Both the scat and the urine of bobcats, most wild felage, really smells like domestics. in many ways. So they do that a lot. So it's one of those things, if you're following a trail and you're not sure what you're seeing, you follow it long enough, it's a good chance that cat's going to urinate and scent mark, and then you can find that, and in a second, you'll know exactly whose trail you're on. Kitty. So they also will do things like this. If they find a carcass or their work, this was from a white-tailed deer fawn. And this is just one little clump or cluster of hair that they sheared out by kind of like turning their head sideways and kind of gnawing away. They've got those very dagger-like carnassials, which are kind of like an adapted premolar, I believe, or molar, on the side, so they can shear off big chunks of fur and things they want to get out of the way to get to the actual digestible meat, right? Like I said, pretty picky eaters, whereas you might find wolves and coyotes tearing away at something like this. The cats will make all these little chunks and kind of distribute them all around. It's pretty typical of a lot of the wild cats. One of their feeding styles when they're on a carcass or a kill site. In Maine, we also are really fortunate to have the highest density of the most uncommon wildcat in North America today. And that's our friend, the Canada lynx. This is a picture of a lynx track floating on top of snow, and look how fat this sucker is. The shape of a lynx trap is almost like a cross, like a plus sign, because you got two big toes up front, two wings, kind of wide toes sticking out on the side, and then this pad in the back. But you still get that kind of C-shaped thing in the middle going on. And they're just amazing floaters. This is what allows them to stay on top of the snow. This is what allows them to get into habitats that coyotes and bobcats can't get into, because they'd be breaking through that snow and they'd be miserable. This is on the far right. That's the track of a gray fox, just for scale. This is actually taken in Rangeley, Maine, over by, I think it's Gull Pond, where Rangeley Lake Heritage Trust has a property. And this is a lynx walking up screen. So not as obvious and dramatic as a plus shape there, because it was shallower snow. It didn't have to splay its toes nearly as much. And just like us, we can decide how we put our feet. You can do them wide, you can do them narrow. Snowshoe hare does the same thing. There's no need to splay, why splay? So the Canada lynx is a fascinating, freakish animal. Really huge, long hind legs, really massive furred feet, right? This is an animal that in Maine is population estimates are well over 1,000 now, which is for the lower 48 pretty amazing. Mostly has to do with the abundance of habitat that works well for lynx, which is a lot of early successional, really thick young trees that support a lot of snowshoe hare, which is the vast bulk of the diet of a lynx. And that has a lot to do with the forestry practices in Maine right now. That tend to cut over a lot of areas, and then a lot of young trees grow back. So for the sake of snowshoe hare and lynx, that's a great thing right now. So it's working for them. The lynx is, I was just trailed up in Jackman, Maine this weekend, actually. We didn't actually find any lynx because we got a foot of snow, but usually we find and trail a lot of lynx up in that region where they're doing quite well. And last month we were up there trailing a mother and a kitten, or it was 2 months ago, I can't remember. And it was just a blast to watch this mother's trail, kind of pretty direct, but still hunting, meandering a little, stopping, looking. You can see in her tracks. And then this yearling, not really a kitten anymore, was just kind of bouncing off to the side, chasing things, going back. I mean, just zigging. I mean, for every 100 feet she went, the yearling went like 500 feet, right? So it's fun to trail a couple of lynx together. Lynx leave a lot of tracks as they walk. They don't direct register a ton because they don't really have to as much because they float so well. So this is a trail of the lynx just kind of slowly walking along on top of the snow. That's about 3-4 feet of snow. We were on snowshoes on this spot, and we were breaking through about 1.5 feet every step, maybe 2 feet of snow, and it was just floating. They don't weigh much. I mean, a big lynx would be 30 pounds. Smaller lynx, maybe 15 to 20. Females are a lot smaller than males, but they're mostly fur and bones and ligaments, right? This is a gnarly old lynx scat, kind of hard. You can see how dense that thing is. It was really, we had to pour hot tea over it and then pick it apart with 2 big sticks to see what it had been eating. No shock, was pretty much snowshoe hare, but we did find a flying squirrel foot in the scat too. Kind of cool. So They do a lot of scent marking as well. Just a tiny little drop here on this stump as it walked by, and just again tilted its rump a little bit to leave that little scent. Right. And when it's really, really cold out, these things can be hard to smell or detect, but when it warms up or it's moist, it's quite obvious. This is the kind of habitat you will trail lynx in. You'll see lynx in. This is dense spruce fir regeneration. So we call this rabbitat. It's just great for rabbits, aka snowshoe hares really up here. And yeah, and the lynx and the hare play this game. See if you can find me. And they often do, just enough. Here's a spot where a lynx was found a snowshoe hare. And this is a little bed where it fed on it. These is the rumen, the stomach contents over here of the snowshoe hare. And these are the feet. They don't ever really eat the feet. They usually just kind of eat the healthy organs or the organs. They eat the meat. Sometimes they'll eat the skull, or they'll bite out the brain and eat that and leave this. Sorry if you're not into dead animal pictures. This is the reality of living. All right. One last family we'll touch on here because we can't do too many. Our friends, the weasel family, also known as mustelids or mustelids. That there is ermine, the short-tailed weasel. Right? The weasel family, 5 toes plus claws, and this little pad in the middle has all these little segments to it. Usually there's about 5 segments in there. It kind of makes a weird arcing, almost like a C, but not quite, like an asymmetrical C shape, because the toes kind of are stepping down. They're very strange. Someone just asked, how often will lynx eat in the wintertime? It depends. I mean, if they eat on average about 1.5 snowshoe hares a day. That's the average mathematically, but they might have good days where they successfully hunt 2 or 3 times and they'll cache food away, but they also might not get anything for a couple of days. So back to the mustelids, the weasel family, hyperactive, super energetic, kind of fierce predators. Some people say they're quote unquote vicious. I just think they're really good at what they do, which is they need to kill to eat to live. So they're really good at that. And they're rather bold. They'll often tackle things much larger than themselves. And in fact, in Maine, in the Maine lynx studies from the early 2000s, the number 1 predator of adult lynx was fisher. Large male fishers were taking adult lynx. They were eating them, which is pretty remarkable and interesting, something that hadn't been well documented before. 5 toes plus claws on all 4 feet is typical of the weasel family. Right? They've all got that. They do a lot of bounding and loping, right? A lot of bloom, 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 right? Kind of rocking horse style. Unlike dogs and cats, they're not stalking too much. They're not trotting very much. And we have a lot of weasels here. Ermine, longtail, mink, fisher, marten, otter. We are in a land of weasels, right? Here's a walking fisher, I think. Here's a loping otter. There's a bounding longtail weasel. Right? They move in a variety of ways. They can be complicated, tricky to follow, and many of them also slide. Otters a ton. So otter on the left, river otters slide any chance they can. Fisher, not too much, but you will see their slides. If you track them long enough, trail them far enough, it's about a 20-foot fisher slide down a hill. And this is about a 30-foot mink slide down a really steep hill into towards some water. Kind of bounced off the end there, poof, like a little jump, and then boom, landed in the water. Would like to score that move there. All right. So that is just a very quick overview of a number of our mostly, well, you notice carnivorous families, carnivores. So this moose here, I was trailing around, says, hey, what about the herbivores? We don't have time for the herbivores tonight. Sorry, moose. The rodents and the ungulates, the deer, the moose, many others, and as well as some of the omnivorous critters. So I just want to point out a couple of resources for folks. The state of Maine does these, they just updated these little pocket guides to Maine tracks. You can find this online if you just Google pocket guide to Maine animal tracks. They're much more updated and accurate than they have been in the past. What's my alarm? Some books I'd recommend. Here's 2. Tracking the Artising is a gorgeous book. I really enjoy reading and looking at. And as far as a thick, full-on resource, Mark Elbrock's, Mammal Tracks Inside North America can't be beat. It's a beast. Not a book you want to carry in the field, but quite a resource. Online resources, I encourage people to check out different, iTrack Wildlife is a nice app for wildlife tracking. There's lots of tracking groups out there, like on Facebook, the New England Tracking Exchange is a great one. There's a lot of different ones. I do a number of online tracking classes, both live and recorded. You can check out at leadwithnature.com. And then we also do in-person trainings. There's a great group called Cyber Tracker in North America. They do tracker certification. So if you really want to go out there and learn a lot in the field and maybe come home with a certification, great resource as well. So that's, oh, and I'll end with this. Here's a little quiz. What's happening here? Little critter comes down off a tree, goes one way, turns around, goes back the other way. For scale, that whole trail is maybe 2 inches wide, 2.5. And then we find this, these little chewed nuts and all these little scats around pouring out of the base of a tree. That's our friend, the flying squirrel. Flying squirrels are great. They're hard to detect without tracking them because they're strictly nocturnal. They're more common than you think. They're in many places. In the Rangeley area, you have both southern and northern flying squirrel. This happens to be a southern. Interesting, fascinating little critters that we share the world with, and tracking will help you find them. So that's what I have for tonight. That's my presentation. Love to hear some questions and whatever else is on your mind. Thanks. Oh, there you go. Got anything, Amanda?
No, I actually learned so much. I'm really curious. Well, what I'd like to do is have a follow-up and talk about, some of the ungulates that you had hinted about.
Oh yeah. I mean,
Right?
this
So
is
that's the
just
next
scratching the
plan.
surface.
Yeah.
I mean, you could literally do a class on each animal, like track and sign, easily for an hour. Yeah, it's awesome. There's so much to learn. But I thought I'd focus on the carnivores because they tend to go far. You can follow their trails. They also sometimes can be indicators of some ecosystem health. If we focus on some of the larger mustelids or the bears, and sometimes some of the cats, that could tell us a bit about what prey species are around and what habitats support them, etc. But yeah, there's so much to think about and so much to learn, and just starts with paying attention and and don't worry about being right or wrong. Just go out there and look at things and post pictures and ask people questions. And you can reach out to me if you want. I'm pretty good at writing back to people. If you follow me here on Facebook, Lead with Nature, on Instagram, on my website, I'm often helping people figure things out. Yeah, because people are just curious and they want to know what's going on around them. And this is an art and a skill that, all of our ancestors, no matter where we were from in the world, at some point, we needed to know. This was as common as breathing. You could argue is the first kind of science and deductive process. And it's, we're just remembering some of these things. And so anyone can do it. It's not terribly complicated. And I'm happy to help people learn.
And Dan, did you see we had 2 questions pop up in the Q&A? How long are your personal tracking trips and sessions is the first one.
Yeah, totally depends. So, I mean, I'll do classes in person. That can be anywhere from a couple of hours to sometimes multiple days. I am a registered Maine guide. So I do, people hire me out to do custom programs, private programs, groups, you name it. You can find all that on my website or just reach out to me. Yep, so totally varies. And then I see all tracks I assume are coyote. Yeah, I need to know more. I need to see pictures. No, but not all straight line tracks are in fact coyotes. Because foxes can do that same thing. I mean, heck, all sort of deer, especially deep snow when you can't see really close. There's a lot of stuff that makes deep holes in the snow that it can be hard to distinguish without getting in there and looking a little closer. So probably not all coyotes.
And I do want to, while we're waiting for more questions to pop up, I do want to mention that at the Ranger Lakes Heritage Trust office, we do keep those state of Maine tracking cards handy for anybody to come in. We encourage everybody to take actually a few, to keep in your pocket, but also up to camp so that when your friends come up, they can bring them out with them.
Yep. It's a good start. Okay, direct versus indirect register. Yeah, so basically, because we're bipeds, we walk on 2 feet usually. Most of the animals we talked about tonight are they're all quadrupeds. Well, not the birds, but they all walk on 4 feet. So when I talk about a direct register, that's like when after you lift up your front foot, your hind foot lands right in that same spot. So in the snow, it like only leaves like one kind of hole on either side of the body in the snow. So it looks like animals on a pogo stick or something, or it's that straight line of tracks. And that's only done when an animal is usually walking or trotting. And only certain animals do it. Like for a porcupine, it's kind of hard. They kind of can. For wide-bodied, short animals, tough to do. Beaver, tough to do. But longer-legged animals, really easy. All the cats, all the dogs, the deer, the moose, they can direct register quite a bit. And indirect just means when it doesn't land quite on top of it, but it's like off to the side a little bit. So it's not directly, it's indirectly registering. Anyone else?
Those were some great visuals. Just trying to picture a beaver.
Yeah, and that's
waddling.
why this stuff does really well in person, because you can actually like play it out, and I'll get people if they want to, we'll like walk like animals, and I'll demonstrate it for them. And it can really help to actually just kind of see. Yeah, and I always tell people, if you're lucky enough to watch a wild animal, like watch how it's moving, then go look at those tracks, right? They just stare at it, watch it, and then go look. Or even if you're walking a dog, or you see a pet move across the sand, the snow, the mud, go look to see what those tracks look like. It'll help you understand the movement, help you tell that story when you actually can see like a little video in your mind. Yeah.
So we do have a couple more moments open for questions. Just had one pop up.
Oh boy, rotor. Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's kind of a silly distinction. So loping is, well, if you picture like a horse cantering, or an animal like going up, like usually get the 3 beat, like a, those are usually lopes. And rotary versus transverse, I usually don't even bother with, because it's kind of a silly distinction. It all just depends on which foot was the lead foot when they came down on the ground. So it leaves a pattern that either looks like a C, like a rotary, like 1, 2, 3, 4, or it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, like a Z. So I only mention it because it is in some of the field guides, and people get really excited about those little distinctions. And that's cool. It's not, doesn't really, I don't know. I don't think the animals probably know or care that they're doing a rotary lope or not, but that's what I meant by rotary lope. Hope that's helpful. You mentioned cats are courting or mating this time of year. Yeah. Good question. Yeah. So most of the canines are done. That was, well, not probably. That's usually earlier in the winter. And then we move on to most of our felines now. And in terms of the weasel family, it depends on what species. So if we took Fisher, for example, I think, yeah, pretty much all the weasels have, their biology is such that they have delayed implantation of a fertilized egg. So they will mate, the egg and the sperm will be fertilized, and then it'll wait before it actually gets set into the uterine wall and start to develop. So like Fisher will be mating usually in the end of this month. So yeah, really soon actually, or late March, early April. But then that egg will sit there for, I think it's almost 9 months before it gets implanted. And then, so the Fisher females are wicked pregnant right now. They're about to have babies, and then they're about to come out and mate. So everything happens in a really small window for Fishers, like birthing, mating, and then not much for a long time, and then all again. So yeah, it depends on the weasel, but they are also close to that time of year. So if you follow a Fisher trail this time of year, you might find them doing a lot more digging around places, maybe looking for some dens, but they'll also use a lot of hollow trees, a lot of cavities and things, sometimes rocky dens as well, just for birthing. Like a lot of these animals don't have dens every night. You know, as a kid, I always thought animals must all go to a den every night, but not really. In winter, most critters just, sleep in temporary little spots. Right? They don't necessarily den up. But when it comes to giving birth, it's quite common to have a more permanent, safer location. Oh, cool. What was the study? Great. I have to dig it up. It was there's many authors on that study. It came out of the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. I think it was published in Journal of Wildlife Management. That Jen Vashon, Vashon, was one of the authors. Yeah, but I could probably find it for you, Preston, if you can't. And Robert asked, can leads change depending on direction of movement, like horses? Yeah, it can, especially if they're turning and stuff like that. And there's a lot of things I don't understand why animals have lead changes because I'm not them, but yeah, it could be that too. And how does the amount of snow? Yeah, snowpack really depends on the animal. So yes, but it totally affects them. I mean, classic examples with we have really cold winter but no snowpack. The small mammal population is really hard on them because the snow is like a nice insulating blanket, and they like to live right at the bottom of that snow, and they can be hidden from predators mostly, and they can be warm. You know, little voles can even breed in the mid to late winter under the snowpack, and mice sometimes too. But um, but that stinks for the owls versus, so it's all relative. It just depends on what species we're talking about. Really deep snow is obviously hard on deer, especially in late winter. Not too much on moose. They do much better on snow. So yeah, it really depends. All righty.